Hello, everyone, and welcome to the December 2021 Unfound newsletter. Yep, it's December 1st. You know what that means. Well, it means a couple of things. First, newsletter time, hence the reason you're listening to this. But also, December 1st is my dad's birthday. I don't think he would mind me telling all of you that he is now 85 years old. Crazy. I remember when he was 40. 11 years younger than I am now. Aging. It's so weird. So happy birthday to him, and yes, I got him a card. Me, I'm good. November was kind of boring compared to October. I had a couple decent disc golf tournaments. I'm maintaining a decent diet. I went to the dentist a couple times. I'm thinking of it as an investment and not as an expense. Either way, I'm getting used to my face being numbed up. Overall, everything is good in Ed Densel land. So let's start where we usually do. Upcoming episodes. December 3rd, Ali Lowitzer. December 10th, Jamie Peterson. December 17th, Belinda Blaniar. December 24th, Betty Topfer. December 31st, the last episode of the year on New Year's Eve. That will be update episode number 10. Other disappearances we are working on: Jennifer Perry, Christian Balke, and then also Christian Balke Thompson. I anticipate that there will not be a January 2022 newsletter. Why? It's hard to write a newsletter when an update episode comes out. Really, what am I going to write about? Plus, the holidays are a busy time, even for a guy like me who doesn't do much. Meaning, after this one, the next newsletter will come out on February 1st, 2022. Mike Moran is the first topic. This is very, very recent news. Mike Moran has died. He was 75 years old. Yes, he died in jail. Am I surprised? That's a hard question to answer. However, nobody would say Mike was the picture of health. The news reports say he had both diabetes and heart issues. So his days were certainly numbered. What does this mean for Megan Lancaster's disappearance? My opinion, not a lot. As I've written and said before, there's nothing I've seen to connect Mike to her missing persons case. Nothing. Yes, Katie thought differently. To remind you, she died a couple months ago. We must look at Megan's disappearance in the context of how she lived her life, which was risky. She surrounded herself with a lot of shady people due to her choices. Meaning, how did Mike cut through all of them to be the one to, let's just say it, kill Megan? It's hard to understand. God rest her soul, but my opinion was always that Katie wanted Mike to be responsible and that her belief was not guided by the facts. Because really, there are no facts to point the finger at any single person. You would need all 10 fingers to point at everyone who could have caused Megan to disappear, and any choice is not better than any other. The perpetrators could be the people she was with earlier that day. The perpetrator could be the guy who found her car. The perpetrator could be the guy who was in the car with Megan that Katie and her husband saw, if that happened. The perpetrator could be a quote-unquote new client that Megan met. Anyone and anything is still possible. At the most, from my point of view, what I was hoping to get out of Mike's trial was to learn more about the inner workings of the corruption in Portsmouth. Maybe one of the women who Mike had forced into sex work would have taken the stand and given us some new leads in regards to Megan's case. In no way was I thinking that the trial would eventually lead to Mike being seen as Megan's killer. What will happen now? I don't know. Maybe the prosecution will reveal to the public the evidence it had against Mike, or maybe not, since there are others who still have yet to go to trial. Overall, as much as I wish Mike would have lived to be judged by a jury of his peers, I don't think a guilty verdict would have gotten us closer to solving Megan's case. Maybe, but I highly doubt it. Next topic, Nova Southeastern University. Yes, although November went back to normalcy and was a bit boring compared to October, Easily the most exciting point of the last 30 days was traveling to Fort Lauderdale to speak at NSU. On top of that, I got to meet one of my favorite people, Dr. Grace Telesco. Of course, you know her from the shows we've done for the last 18 months. We had a great time. How did the speaking engagement go? Wonderfully. In contrast to Northwestern State, where I spoke to 2 classes, and NSU, I only spoke to 1. However, this class was a bit longer, about 90 minutes. The technology worked perfectly. The students were engaged. They asked a lot of questions at the end. And at the end, I also got some great NSU swag that I showed off on the live show that following Wednesday. Did you watch it? I hope you did. After Dr. Telesco took me to her office, which had so much 9/11 NYC memorabilia. Really incredible. Then she and I and her assistants went to a fantastic pizza place just off campus. We sat there and talked for at least an hour and a half. Then I drove back to Clearwater Beach. The trip could not have gone better. Everyone was so nice, and I thought I did a pretty good job of covering the material. Although I'm a tough grader and believe I can always do better. Yes, it was filmed, and a highlights video now exists on the Unfound Podcast Channel if you haven't checked it out already. When will my next speaking engagement be? That is hard to say. However, I am confident it will happen in the next few months. Where? I don't know, but when I find out, you'll be some of the first people to know. Steve Pankey, the next topic. You know by now that the jury could not come to a decision regarding the 3 major charges against Steve. Yes, on the 4th, lying to investigators or something like that, the jury found Steve guilty. However, let's be honest, nobody really cared about that one. As of right now, news out of Greeley says that the earliest Steve will be retried will be May 2022. Yes, that far from now. Why 5 months from now? Because Steve's lawyer, Mr. Vorst, has decided he doesn't want to go through another trial, meaning the public defender will represent Steve the next time, if there is a next time. And this group will need until May 2022 to go over everything from the first trial and anything else that could be relevant to providing Steve with an adequate defense. So, why did the trial result in a hung jury? And was I surprised? To answer the second question first, no, I was not surprised. After I was on the stand, I went back to the beginning on the Greeley Tribune website to see how everything had gone from day one. Then every day until the end, I read stories about how the trial went after I was in Greeley. I followed it as closely as I could from 2,000 miles away. And what I decided fairly quickly is the prosecution did not make its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Sure, some people on the jury thought so, but given that I was doubtful, I had to believe that at least a couple of the jurors thought like I did, and I was right. So no, not surprised. Now that first question, why did it end up hung? Very simply, Michael Rourke and company never were able to put Steve on Janelle Street. Not that day, not that evening, not on the day before or after her disappearance. In fact, nobody is even sure if Steve had ever been on her street in his entire life. In fact, reading the articles, they never even attempted to try to put Steve on Janelle Street. And obviously some of the jurors noticed that. 1984 or 2014, that's always going to hurt a prosecutor's case. Another reason for the hung jury was the motive that Steve would have killed Janelle is very difficult. Another reason for the hung jury was that the motive that Steve would have killed Janelle is very hard to understand. He didn't live close to the Matthews. The Matthews family admitted they'd never heard of Steve. On top of that, Russ Ross, the guy who dropped Janelle off that evening and who also worked with Steve at one time, admitted in the interview I did with him, which was part of the evidence, that he never believed Steve was following him around. Russell Ross also said he never suspected that Steve caused Janelle's disappearance during the 35 years she was missing. So, if Steve didn't live close, the Matthews didn't know him, and Russ didn't think Steve was following him, how the heck is the jury supposed to find Steve guilty? The prosecution had another issue. In fact, we might even call this the biggest one. I don't think putting Steve's ex-wife Angela on the stand had the effect the prosecution thought it would. Why? Before I answer, I want to state for the record that the ex-wife Angela and I are friends. In fact, I believe she is on the newsletter email list. I've spoken to her many times since October 2019. But for the record, I never talked to her until after I interviewed Steve. She contacted me specifically because she found out I interviewed him. On the stand, Angela surely gave testimony that surely did not paint Steve in the best of lights. He was controlling. He was obsessed with Janelle's disappearance. Steve allegedly buried something in their yard. A car that they had caught fire not long after Janelle went missing. Certainly serious stuff. And there's no question that these acts as a whole could be seen as indications that Steve caused Janelle's disappearance. Certainly. The problem? Also on the stand, Angela admitted that she never entertained the idea that Steve could have harmed Janelle until 1999, 15 years after the disappearance. And conveniently, some might say this was not long before the two got divorced. Why was this damaging to the prosecution's case? The reason is that the case Rourke represented to the jury was essentially everything Angela knew over those 15 years, yet she suspected nothing of Steve. So if she, the person who lived under the same roof with Steve all those years, including the day in which Janelle disappeared, if she never suspected him, why should the jury be any different? If Angela didn't run to the police during those 15 years to tell them she thought Steve killed Janelle, then why would the jury come to a guilty verdict? Granted, I respect Angela for being honest. She could have easily said, oh yeah, from day one I thought he did it, but I was afraid, I feared for my life and my son's life. Should Steve find out, I went to the police. She could have tried that. And many people do. But she didn't. And I respect that. However, I think her testimony overall undermined the prosecution's belief that it was so obvious that Steve killed Janelle. Well, if Angela didn't think so, seeing what she did for those 15 years, then it's not hard to understand how no one should think so. And that's how you end up with a hung jury. There were other problems too. No forensics. Juries these days hate that. The defense had a viable alternate theory regarding the neighbor, Norris Drake. Unfortunately and inconveniently, he is deceased. And although the prosecution proved Steve to be a liar, at the same time they showed him to be a paranoid guy who doesn't see the world like the rest of us, which surely also put doubt in the jurors' minds about whether his lying was malicious or an illness. Now, I will say something. Had this trial occurred 40 years ago, in 1981, and all the prosecution has was a suspect lying over and over and over like Steve did, I think a Steve-like defendant gets convicted. Back then, to impeach a suspect's character would have been enough. In 1981, Steve would have gone to the slammer. Today, not even close. Since the mid-2000s, due to the TV show, the CSI effect has taken over murder trials. Wood, you're telling us why some of the jurors found him not guilty. Why did at least one of them find him guilty? I'll read that again. Well, Ed, you're telling us why some of the jurors found him guilty. Why did at least one of them find him guilty? Hey, there's certainly another side to this. Really, what are the odds that Steve Pankey would become obsessed on a disappearance in which his ex-coworker Russell Ross was the person to drop Janelle off? That is one heck of a coincidence. Even I can admit that. Moreover, I think I established in the interview I did with Steve that how he came to know Russell Ross. Moreover, I think I established in the interview I did with Steve that how he came to know Russ dropped Janelle off is still a bit up in the air. I stand by my assertion that no newspapers at the time released the identity of Mr. Ross. Well, Steve said he must have found out about Russ being involved from the TV news. Is there proof of that? Somebody might want to look into that. On top of those points, there are still a few people who don't suffer from the CSI effect. They think that people who lie about something must have done something wrong. And Steve certainly lied about a lot, even admitting to lying to me in the interview. Am I offended? Not really. All of this amounts to a hung jury. Most importantly, there is no scientific proof Steve Pankey killed Janelle Matthews. What do I think? I've said since I interviewed Steve that I have my doubts about his guilt. Actually, the defense in bringing up Norris Drake portrayed a scenario that has been very much in my mind since October 2019. A neighbor did it. If I had kids, would I allow them around Steve Pankey? Nope. Would I ride in a car, just the two of us cross country, me and Steve? Nope. Would I ever recommend Steve for a job? Nope. But none of that makes him guilty. Yet he's still a weird and most likely very bad guy. If there is a retrial, will I be asked/required to go to Greeley, Colorado again? I have no idea. Using my interview the first time around didn't help the prosecution. Would it really make a difference the second time? I suppose that depends on what strategy the prosecution wants to use. The same or something different. Some of you have asked me about the jury split. How many found Steve guilty and how many thought the opposite? I have no idea. That information has not been released. I would love to know, though. The prosecution and defense surely know. If there is a retrial, I think that would mean that the first jury was very close to convicting, but there were a couple holdouts. If there is no retrial, then what's logical is that Steve almost got a blanket non-guilty the first time around. Next topic, John Lorden. I hope John and I surprised you with our mutual shows a couple weeks ago. I had brought it up back before I went to Greeley, since John had tangentially been connected to Steve Pankey through Steve being a patron of John's YouTube channel, and since I was actually in the trial, I thought it would be neat for him to interview me about my experience so his viewers could hear what it was like firsthand. Likewise, I wanted to talk to John about the trial, getting his impressions, while also, quote-unquote, talking shop about the true crime community and its current status. I also had no idea what John's background was, so I thought you'd want to find out about it as well. Truthfully, I had no idea he was involved in entertainment like I had been at one time. No idea. I even found out he is a huge Star Trek fan like myself. Who knew? I'm not going to go through both shows. If you want to listen to them again, please do so, but I would like to comment further on a couple topics John and I covered. First, his experience with the Alyssa Lamb TV show. What John experienced is my nightmare. Truly. I'm not writing that to be traumatic. To choose to be a part of something, then it comes out in a totally different way, making me look bad or stupid or whatever else, is something my pride, ego, and personality cannot take. Why? Because I would feel like I had been fooled, and that is not a feeling I like. Really, who does? But I would be especially sensitive to it if the issue was connected to Unfound. So, to have to do what John did, explain how he wasn't even around at the time that all the harassment and everything was happening, would have been for me, well, I have to say he handled it much more maturely and professionally than I would have. Why would I be irate? Truthfully, in doing Unfound, I'm always putting my best, honest foot forward. I do my work honestly, legally, and morally, without question. The only people who should be ticked off at me are the suspects mentioned during the episodes. That's it. And really, that's one of the reasons Unfound exists. However, when somebody like an editor, a producer, a writer of a TV show, should that ever happen, twists something I said or did, I would take it personally because I would know he or she did it for themselves, even though we would all be working as a team to put a Netflix show together. Moreover, and although this didn't come up with John, do you think the editors and producers of that show would ever have done that to Nancy Grace? Twist her behavior and words to make everything look the opposite of the way it actually was? Of course not. Would they do it to John Walsh? To Joe Kenda? To Paula Zahn? Ain't no way. Would they do it to me? Absolutely. That's the reason I will never give them the opportunity to do so. This is the reason I brought up the topic of the true crime community compared to mainstream media. We are not taken seriously by them. How do I know? Because they screwed over one of the best true crime people in the podcasting/YouTubing business. I'll read it again. Because they screwed over one of the best true crime people in the podcasting/YouTubing business. That's how I know. Whereas we would never do that to them. Granted, I never edit interviews for content. But if I were to have John Walsh on some time, I would never, ever edit words to make it look like he did or said something he didn't. Not even if it meant causing a stir and getting 1 trillion downloads. I would never do it. Obviously, Netflix did and would. Please remember that the next time you watch any true crime TV show, remember they're crafting the show in a way that is beneficial for them. Not for the police, the family, or anyone else. The second point I would like to make about my talks with John was how sure he was that Steve Pankey would be convicted. Yes, I know I wrote a dissertation about the trial in this newsletter already. However, from a standpoint of host interviewing host, I was surprised John was so sure. Why? Well, he and I do very similar programs. He has about the same amount of experience I do. True, I am a specialist, where he dabbles in a bit of everything. Although I'm not sure that matters. We're around the same age, yada, yada, yada. Yet you heard him. John thought it was pretty much a slam dunk. I was the opposite. Why? I don't have a good answer. Is it because I covered the case in depth? Maybe. Is it because I was in the Steve Pankey trial? I don't think so. Is it because I cover disappearances, so I tend to be much more cynical about justice being done? Could be. Just something interesting and surprising. I wonder if you thought so as well. The final issue regarding John and my conversations was the issue of the true crime community and the legal professions. We talked about how I was the first person from the true crime community who had been involved in a trial in a long time, if ever. This didn't seem to surprise John. However, it does surprise me. Why? It surprises me because so much in the true crime community is about alleged quote-unquote research. You'll notice the R word is not one I use very much. I'm a reporter, or say that R word. I'm a reporter, I'm an interviewer, I'm an investigator, I'm a speaker, I'm a presenter. In fact, for a long time, I've made fun of the word research in its relation to the true crime community because I'm not really sure how much people really do it. So given that there are like 1,000 hosts out there, but none has appeared in a trial, I ask you, how much research is being done out there? Because if you're doing research, that means you're finding new relevant pieces of information. And if you're finding new information, should not eventually you get called to testify in a trial that you're working on? You'd think so, but nobody is. Well, except myself. And the only reason I was asked/required to appear in Colorado is because the interview I did with Steve worked well in the prosecution strategy. That's it. It was not because I found something new about Steve that connected him to Janelle's murder. Just being honest. What I'm saying is the true crime community has a long way to go in this department. I think there's evidence to show that although we are covering many unsolved crimes, there isn't a lot of proof we are finding anything new. This could be the reason the mainstream crime media does not take us seriously. Could be. But Ed, what about Payne Lindsay with Tara Grinstead's murder? Good question. My answer? Did Payne testify at the murder trial? No, he did not. Was his podcast mentioned in the trial at all? Maybe it was. Either way, are we sure he didn't just happen to cover Tara's disappearance at just the right time? It's a question that should seriously be contemplated if we are to look at what effect the true crime community is having on the solving of crimes. What I'm saying is, if true crime podcasts and videos are digging up new information, then surely more hosts would be getting asked to appear in trials. Why? Because they would have to explain how they went about doing what they did. That no hosts are getting asked must mean the opposite is true. Nobody is really finding anything new. Not trying to depress you. Hey, this is all I do, so imagine how I feel. But my opinion is not enough true crime people think this way. In fact, I'll ask you, because I know many of you watch and listen to many other programs, does any other host besides myself bring this kind of stuff up? This analysis of what we're doing, how we do it, and whether we're having any effect. My guess is the number is very low of the hosts who do that. But we must think like this if we want to continue to build credibility with the public. Podcasting and YouTubing are still very new. I would like for true crime to continue to have a presence on these mediums. But if we're not having much effect, in the long run, it could all go away. Just like Amway. At some point, you have to start selling soap. Something to think about. Okay, I will now cautiously step down off my soapbox and complete this newsletter for December 2021. Thanks for reading and listening.